Today's special guest is Stephen King from GrowthForce, and he is here to talk to us about fraud prevention for nonprofits. Now we're going to talk about some of the different types of frauds there are out there, what we can do about it, and even some helpful resources. So with that, let's welcome Stephen. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you so much for doing this video. Before, off camera, we had talked about some stats, and you have some pretty spectacular stats in a report that just came out. So you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. The Society of Fraud Examiners does this report to the nation on occupational fraud every 2 years. And it's a big report. They look at globally, they look at the United States, they look at the different size organizations. And the 2022 report, the total amount of fraud was $3.6 billion. I mean, billion with a B. And the average case gets bigger the smaller the organization. So for nonprofits in particular, where you think that people are there for the mission and they're passionate and they're trustworthy, you'd be really shocked at how big of a loss. In fact, for the average loss across all size organization, it's $117,000. But in a smaller organization with less than 50 employees, that grows to $150,000 because there's not enough separation of duties. And I can explain how you prevent it, why, but the smaller you are, the worse it is. And what's interesting is in churches had even higher than nonprofits. So religious organizations are really suspect because you think that, people are there for the mission. Well, if there's been a lot of studies done. If you give somebody the keys to the vault, and if they'll justify that rationalization to take advantage of your trust.
And a lot of our followers and subscribers are smaller nonprofits and founders that don't really have the education in fund development and reading financial statements and the professional executive director experience that some of the bigger organizations have. So I can see that. I can see how that happened.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty shocking. I mean, 94% of fraudsters are first-time offenders with clean records. It's not that you hired criminals. It's just that if you don't have the right systems of internal controls in place, then you're going to have risk. And so, the basic, simplest thing to take out of today is you have to separate duties. There are three things that have to happen on every single accounting transaction, anything related to money. You have to separate the person who approves the transaction from the person who enters the transaction from the person who reconciles that account. So for example, this is the most common, the person who pays the bills should never, ever reconcile the bank account. And somebody else needs to be signing that check and approving the bill. So that's one of the reasons why GrowthForce does outsourced accounting for nonprofits. That's one of the reasons why organizations like us or your CPA exist, is to, if you only have one person, then outsource the other part. Have somebody that can look over the shoulders of that trusted office manager or that person with the title of accounting manager, but may or may not have an accounting degree.
Okay, well, I know that a lot of nonprofits here in Canada, the smaller ones, just have a bookkeeper and then have their books audited once a year by an accountant.
Yeah, I'm a CPA, or in Canada, they'd call it a chartered accountants. I've been one for 36 years. And audits are really valuable and important because it tells the foundations that you've had somebody from the outside looking at your books. But that audit is not designed to catch fraud. That audit is designed to catch whether or not the financial statements are fairly stated. And there's a lot of disclosures that happen in an audit. You have to sign a letter that says that you have provided them with all the information for them to audit. Now, what will happen is a good auditor will look for that system of internal controls. Do you have separation of duties? But if you don't have them, they're going to put that in a management letter that will be a recommendation for the board or for the audit committee. But oftentimes those don't get looked at. The audit passed, you got a stamp of approval, you send it to the foundation, it's in the annual report, and we move on to the next fire. But I think the key thing here is to really look at who's approving the bill payroll, or the donor statements, the deposits that come in, whatever has to touch cash, who's entering it into your accounting system. And we specialize in QuickBooks, so I can talk a lot about how you prevent fraud using some of the tools inside QuickBooks. And then who's reconciling those payroll ledgers and payroll taxes, and make sure it's not the same person who actually paid the payroll.
Well, and you had also talked about how there's a lot of cyber fraud going on right now as well.
Oh, cyber is the single biggest one going on right now. And I would suggest that, anybody who's listening really needs to learn about a great cyber training course called KNOWBE4, KNOWBE and the number 4. And what it is it's a great training program that you can send out to your employees to teach them, what do you look for? Because this is how most nonprofits are getting ripped off right now. And it also sends out some of these scary emails that I'm going to talk about to help you find out whether or not your employees are setting you up for risk. So there's a whole concept here of what they call phishing. Phishing is the idea of somebody who is sending an email that looks like a legitimate email, but it has nothing to do with your organization. The challenge is, though, they're so sophisticated that the fraudsters, the criminals, will actually set up an email, a website, and mimic what it looks like for your organization. So we just saw one with a client of ours who, we're an outsourced accounting department, right? So we got an email saying, hey, we need to transfer some money for that big grant we just received from the XX Foundation. It looks legit. It's got the picture of the executive director in the signature file. The link in the bottom of the email is to their Facebook page. Everything looks legit, but they reverse 2 letters in the website and just copy the website, but do a small change. And they send that email saying, hey, can you transfer this money from this grant to this account? Now, how do they know about the account? It's called spear phishing. They're going after, cyber criminals are looking and taking the time to find organizations that have promoted on social media that we just received a $500,000 grant from, I'd pick one, MacArthur Foundation. And we're so thankful, we're so excited. And now all of a sudden it's like, okay, they got a lot of money. They won't notice if I go in there and ask them for $35,000. And if your employees are not trained to know what kind of links are dangerous, they'll get into your email really easily, and they'll be able to see who's your accountant. And they'll send that email to that bookkeeper, that office manager, saying, from the executive director, saying, hey, please transfer $35,000 to this account for the MacArthur grant. And you wouldn't even know that it was gone until the money's out of the bank account, and you'll never get it back.
Wow, I didn't know this.
Scary, right? Yeah. So KnowBe4 is a great training. It teaches your employees what to look for, and it's simple things like just mousing over the email address, even though it might say, Joanne@mycharity.com, but they spelled charity with, CHIITRY instead of spelling charity the right way. And it's just small enough that you wouldn't even notice it. But if you put your mouse over that email, the real email address comes up, and it's always going to be some hidden email, but it's clearly not you. And that's, one of the simple ways to find it.
Okay, I'll link that training below in the description and in the show notes on the podcast.
I think the biggest thing that you got to watch out for is payroll fraud. Payroll fraud really requires a special view, because the average theft for payroll fraud, according to the Society of Fraud Examiners in this report to the nation on occupational fraud, is $90,000. And on average, it's about $8,000 a month, and it takes a year to catch. So what they do is they go in and they will set up a fake payroll, another employee. Or one of the ones that, I hope there's not a lot of bookkeepers listening because I don't want to teach them how to be a crook. But, if the bookkeeper is paying the payroll and doing the payroll taxes and sending out the W-2s at the end of the year, we saw one where that bookkeeper was set up extra withholdings for their payroll. So let's say that you're making, I'm going to use a round number, $50,000, right? And you're going to pay, 25% in taxes, just to use round numbers. So you're, over the course of the year, you're going to spend, $12,000 in payroll taxes. So every paycheck, if you pay once a month, you get $1,000 taken out of the paycheck. Well, in this case, what they did was they took $2,000 out and they bumped up their gross payroll by an extra $1,000. So now at the end of the year, instead of making $50,000, their W-2 shows that their wages were $62,000. They got an extra 12 grand. Now you say, okay, how come the executive director didn't catch that? Well, all the executive director is doing is signing the payroll checks, right? For the net amount. The net amount still shows, $512, but the taxes withheld is more. And unfortunately, there's no easy way to see that because the taxes withheld, it's not math. It depends on, are you married? Are you single? Do you have 0 exemptions, or you can have as many as 99? And so the amount of money that comes out of your paycheck is up to each person's individual situation. Now, Social Security taxes and unemployment taxes, there's some things that are going to be fixed, right? They're 7.65%. But that's the smallest amount. The bigger amount is the amount of federal withholding. And so the ability to be able to make sure that to add extra taxes means that you're going to pay that money to the government. So the executive director is approving a payment to the Internal Revenue Service, and you don't know if it's right or wrong. You're taking money out of your employees' paychecks and remitting it on their behalf. And so you have to make sure that the W-2s and the tax returns at the end of the year are not being done by the person who paid the payroll.
And you had also said check tampering.
Well, this is check it is a very common one. We see this more often. The classic example is somebody's got down on their luck. Their spouse lost their job, or now suddenly they have a family member living with them who's ill, or their financial situation changed and they can't pay that AT&T, that phone bill. And so if they have the same phone bill as the organization does, if the organization also has AT&T, well, then they can just submit 2 bills with 1 check and pay their bill and the organization's bill. And so we just saw this happen with a bookkeeper at one of our clients. And because we're reconciling the bank account, we saw, because they separated the duties, right? The person who's paying the bill should never reconcile the bank account. We saw that there was a larger amount. It was almost double what the normal bill would. So you immediately look at that and say, okay, what's going on here? And then we use a system called bill.com, which is really great. I highly recommend, if you want to reduce the risk of fraud, implement bill.com. It's all on your phone, which is really nice because in a lot of organizations, the treasurer has to approve or sign any checks over, let's say, $5,000, right? So that means that instead of coming to the office and signing checks or having to deliver checks, they just get an email with a list of the bills they have to approve for payment. And it's effectively a digital signature using your Face ID and your fingerprint. And it all syncs with QuickBooks. So we found that we reduced the cost of paying a bill from over $12, almost $13 per bill, when you add up all the labor and the stamp and the envelope and all the time chasing signatures, to less than $3 to pay a bill, including the cost of bill.com. But more importantly, if you're using checks, stop, because this is how small nonprofits get ripped off.
Yeah, I'm surprised by how many nonprofits are still using checks and still will only accept checks as donations rather than some of the other features that are out there, like the PayPal and the Google Pay and the Apple Pay.
Yeah, Venmo or Zelle. I mean, you got to make it easy for the donor to pay, right? I got to be the chief financial officer and then the director of development for Amnesty International, USA. So $20 million, the world's largest human rights organization. And one of the things I learned is if you make it easy for the donors, you'll get that spontaneous contribution, right? It's kind of like, that's why they put the chewing gum at the cash register. I was like, yeah, I could use some breath mints or some breath spray. You want to be able to do the same thing, be able to have a click. I feel really good about this email, or I'm on your website. I want to be able to pay right away. So we set that up for our clients, and then it automatically goes into the accounting system and then automatically goes into the donor management system.
Yeah, no, I was working with an organization that just would not get on board. And then even the tax receipts and the thank yous they went all out by hand and took forever. And it was painful. I'm a one-click girl. I'll see something, I'm inspired. I just one click.
Exactly right. So, I think the key thing though is, there's the fundamental concept here is that you have to have separation of duties and you have to have policies and procedures to make sure that everyone understands what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. And it's very simple to write policies and procedures these days. In fact, there's a number of tools. Domo is one of them, where you can just, as you are doing some work, it'll screen capture what you're doing and then put it into a procedure manual. And I think the key thing there is that if it's documented, what that means is when you have turnover, which in this age of resignation is greater than ever, and nonprofits are struggling more than the for-profits because it's hard to afford to pay somebody going rate. When that new person comes in, you have the procedures, the separation of duties is written down. You understand what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. For example, on cash receipts, the person who is receiving the cash from the mail should never be the person who makes the deposit. You want to have a log. They want to record every deposit, even going back to the old school days. I don't care if it's a piece of paper or if it's an Excel, whatever it is. You want to have a trail that says, here are all the checks that came in the mail, and then be able to have somebody else make that deposit. Now you can go back and reconcile if something's off.
Yeah, I know. Even the sweetest people, when tempted, can make mistakes.
You want to watch for changes in employee behavior. This is one of the things, there's been a number of things that have come out in this new report that from the Society of the Society of Fraud Examiners. One of the key things here is being alert to changes in employee behavior. I mentioned that you want to be looking for, do you have somebody who's living beyond their means, right? All of a sudden it's like, how can you afford a Tesla? Or, they're having financial difficulties. They have somebody who, like I mentioned before, who has suddenly got medical bills that they didn't have, or somebody lost their job. Or another one is exhibiting control issues, right? If you've got a bookkeeper and they're the only one who's allowed to get into QuickBooks, and nobody can have the password, and nobody else can do the payroll except me, that's a red flag. In fact, the payroll providers, the ADPs and the Paychecks of the world, they're cheaper than I can do it. And I'm a professional bookkeeping service. I can't do it at their cost because they have such great scale. So anytime you have a bookkeeper who's saying, no, I need to do all the payroll and the payroll taxes and the W-2s, that is a big red flag. If they're controlling everything and they want to do the bank reconciliations, that's how they cover their track. So I would watch out for that.
Yeah. Well, I've also seen a lot of people come into nonprofits very excited and exuberant, and then suddenly they start to get a little bit jaded and they're frustrated and they're overworked and they're underpaid, and
Yes. Yeah. So the way you catch this, the single biggest way you catch this is through hotlines, right? You have to start with a tone at the top, right? You have to set in writing, you have to have a policy that says, this is not acceptable. This is what is not acceptable in our organization. You cannot use organizational funds for personal benefit. Now you would think, okay, you wouldn't have to say that. No, it needs to be in the employee handbook. And it's also important because if you do have a theft and you want to bring a criminal charge, well, the first thing the defense attorney is going to say is, well, how did they know they weren't allowed to do that? Was it in writing? There's nowhere that says they weren't allowed. All they did was they were borrowing the money. They were going to pay it back. And then a jury is going to say, well, you know what? Maybe they were borrowing. And then look, their mother was sick with cancer. And I'm sure she never did it before. She has no criminal record. We're not going to put her in jail because her mother is sick, or whatever the reason is that they have. But if it's in writing, you can bring a criminal charge and a civil charge. And but it has to be in writing. So you want to put that in your employee handbook, and then set up an anonymous hotline. That's the let everyone know if you see something, say something. And it could be an email address. It could be, something as simple as fraud at charity.com, or whatever you want it to be, hotline at charity.com. In fact, in this report, it's the first time that emails and websites, large organizations will set up an anonymous hotline for web form to say, if you ever see something, say something, by going to charity.com/hotline. And for the first time, emails and websites are greater than phone calls. So, you don't even need to have a phone number. Just set up an email. That's the fastest way to be able to uncover fraud, because getting tips from employees is how you'll catch it. And then partnering with your accountant to be able to not have one person do it all.
Yeah, these are some great tips, and I learned a lot. I thought I knew a few things in this area, but no, that was fantastic. And is there anything that we missed? Anything that you wanted to cover?
No, I think the big thing here is that most people think it's not going to happen to me, and those are the organizations that it happens to. You've really got to put in place the best practices. Separating duties has nothing to do with trust. No systems are based on trust. It's based on what a well-run organization does. You have a custodial responsibility for your donor's money. And so by making sure that you're putting the best practices in place, number one, you're going to fly through that audit. You're not going to have to spend, because the auditor charges you by the hour for that management letter, for anything that's outside of the audit. And it'll be faster to get through an audit, but you're going to reduce the risk of fraud. So just separate those duties. The person who approves the transaction, who pays the bills or receives the money, needs to be different from the person who reconciles the accounts or makes the deposits. That's all you have to do. It's pretty simple.
That makes sense. And call you as well.
GrowthForce. Yeah. If anybody's struggling with financial management or not getting actionable insights for their board so that they can make better decisions, go to growthforce.com. That's GROWTH force.com, growthforce/NFP as non-for-profit. And we have a chat bot and a form that you can start a conversation with somebody on our team, and we'll be happy to share some good advice. And we also have a lot of other resources, including we have a guide to reducing fraud that we just updated for this new 2022 report. We also have a webinar on how to run better, grow faster, and raise more money. And I combine my director of development experience with my CFO experience and serving hundreds of nonprofits over 30 years to help nonprofits achieve more outcomes and further their mission.
That's fantastic. I'm going to leave all of that in the description as well, because especially that guide. I think that would be most helpful.
Yeah, or email me. It's Stephen, STEPHEN, @growthforce.com, GROWTH force.com.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Stephen.
Thanks, Joanne. Thanks for having me.